The prairie wind whispers tales of hardship, but for Elara, it carried only the chilling truth of abandonment. Left sightless at a desolate, wrong station, her world shrank to the grit under her fingers and the fading echo of a departing stagecoach. Until a silent rancher offered a calloused hand, and a chance to see the world anew, not with her eyes, but with her heart. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe survival can lead to love, hit like and subscribe for more. This is a story of more than just survival, it's about the fragile trust built in silence, the unexpected lessons learned in desolation, and how two solitary souls, bound by an accident, might teach each other to truly live. Her journey began not with a destination, but with a profound, echoing silence. The rattle and creak of the stagecoach wheels faded into the vast, indifferent hum of the prairie. Elara Vance stood where the driver had curtly deposited her, a small, worn valise at her feet, her slender white cane sweeping an arc of dust and unfamiliar emptiness. The sun beat down, a dry, relentless heat that pressed against her face and neck. She called out, her voice thin against the sighing wind, "Hello? Is anyone here?" Only the whisper of dry grass answered. This was not the bustling stop she'd been promised, not the place where a representative from the new school for the territory's children was to meet her. This was nothing. A ghost of a station, the air thick with the scent of sun-baked earth, distant, unknown vegetation, and the faint, acrid tang of an old, cold fire. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the numbness of her long journey. Blindness had taught her many things, patience, resilience, a heightened awareness of the world felt and heard, but it had not prepared her for this utter desolation, this profound aloneness under an unseen sky. She had been traveling for weeks, the dream of a teaching position in the growing west of Fragile Beacon. It was a chance to be more than a burden, more than the poor blind Miss Vance she'd become back east after the fever stole her sight. The stagecoach driver, a man whose voice was as rough as the roads, had clearly made a mistake, or perhaps, she thought with a surge of bitterness, he simply hadn't cared enough to ensure her safe arrival at the correct junction. Now, with each passing moment, the silence grew heavier, the sun hotter. Exhaustion, a deep, bone-weary fatigue, began to pull at her. She sank carefully to her valise, her hands trembling as she tried to gather her thoughts, to fight the rising tide of despair. Thomas Harding saw her from the rise where he was checking a stretch of fence line. A lone figure, unnaturally still in the shimmering heat haze. He urged his horse, Bess, forward, caution ingrained in every line of his lean frame. Solitude was his blanket, his remote rancho world he'd carved out of the unforgiving land, and strangers were rare, often trouble. As he drew closer, he saw the cane resting beside her, the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head as if listening to something beyond his hearing. A woman. Alone. And blind. A muscle twitched in his jaw. This was a complication he didn't need. He reined Bess in a few feet away, the creak of She scrambled to her feet, her voice tight with a mixture of fear and forced composure. "There's been a mistake. The stage, they left me at the wrong station. I was supposed to be met for a teaching position." He looked around at the dilapidated lean-to that barely qualified as a station. "Ain't been a regular stage stop here in 5 years," he stated. "And no school for 100 miles, none that I know of." The words fell like stones into Elara's fragile hope. Tears pricked behind her useless eyelids, but she fought them back. She would not break down in front of this stranger, this gruff voice in the emptiness. "Then, can you tell me how to get to Sweetwater Creek?" That was the name of the settlement. Harding considered. Sweetwater was 2 days' hard ride, assuming one knew the way and had a good horse. For her, alone and unsighted? Impossible. He was a man of few words and fewer inclinations towards charity that involved upheaval, but leaving her here was not an option. The coyotes would find her by nightfall. "Sweetwater's a long way. You can't stay here." He dismounted, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth. "I've got a cabin. You can rest there. Figure things out in the morning." It wasn't an invitation so much as a stark statement of the only viable option. Elara hesitated. Trusting a strange man in this wilderness went against every instinct of self-preservation she possessed. But the alternative was far worse. "Thank you, Mr. Harding," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I would be grateful." The journey to his ranch was an ordeal. He walked, leading Bess, on whose back he'd reluctantly placed Elara. She clung on, disoriented by the unfamiliar movement, the uneven terrain causing her to sway precariously. He offered no conversation, only terse warnings, "Hold tight," or "Branch, low." His hand, calloused and strong, would occasionally steady her elbow, a brief, impersonal contact. The air grew cooler as the sun began to dip, bringing with it the sense of pine and damp earth. She heard the lowing of cattle in the distance, the rush of a creek. His cabin was small, she could tell by the echo of his footsteps on the wooden floor, by the contained scent of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. He led her to a simple cot in a corner, a rough blanket folded at its end. "Water's in the bucket by the door. Food on the table when I make it." And then he was gone, the sound of his boots receding outside. Slowly, Elara began to explore her small corner. Her fingers traced the rough-hewn logs of the wall, the surprisingly smooth surface of the small, unsteady table beside the cot. The blanket was coarse but clean. She found the water bucket, the dipper, and drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. Exhaustion finally claimed her, and she sank onto the cot, the sounds of the wilderness outside a strange, unsettling lullaby. Days melted into a quiet routine. Thomas Harding was a creature of habit. He rose before dawn, the smell of his brewing coffee the first thing Elara registered. He would eat a quick, silent meal, and then the cabin door would open and close, followed by the sound of his departing horse. He returned at dusk, tired, smelling of dust, sweat, and the land. He never spoke much, but Elara began to discern moods from the way he moved, the set of his jaw she could hear in the tension of his silence. She, in turn, mapped her world with painstaking care. The 3 steps from her cot to the table. The slight dip in the floorboards near the hearth. The way the morning sun, a diffuse warmth on her skin, fell through the single small window. She learned the sounds of the ranch, the rhythmic creak of the porch swing he never used, the clatter of pans when he prepared their meager meals, the soft snuffling of his dog, a quiet shadow named Jed, who eventually took to lying near her feet. She tried to make herself useful, carefully sweeping the floor around her cot with a broom she found, folding her blanket precisely each morning, her movements slow but deliberate. He watched her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't aware. Watched the way her hands moved, like delicate antennae, reading the world. Watched the patience in her still form as she sat on the porch, her face turned towards the sounds of the day. He started leaving things in predictable places, the water pitcher always to the left of the dry sink, her tin cup beside it. He'd clear a path to the outhouse, removing any stray branches or stones. Small, unspoken gestures. One evening, as he was mending a piece of tack, the silence was broken by Elara. "Mr. Harding," she began, her voice hesitant, the sound, like water falling over stones. "Is that the creak I heard when we arrived?" He looked up, surprised. He'd almost forgotten she was there, so quiet had she become. "Yes. Runs south of the cabin. Not far. It sounds peaceful," she murmured, a wistful note in her voice. He grunted an affirmative, but found himself describing, in clipped phrases, how the willows grew thick along its banks, how deer sometimes came to drink at dawn. He was teaching her the shape of his world through sound and his own sparse words, and in doing so, he found himself noticing it anew. A storm blew in one afternoon, sudden and violent. The sky, Elara imagined, must have turned black. The wind howled around the small cabin like a tormented spirit, rattling the door in its frame. Thunder cracked overhead, sharp and deafening, making the very floorboards vibrate. Elara, caught on the porch, cried out as a particularly strong gust tore at her, threatening to rip her from her chair. Thomas, who had been securing the lean-to where he kept his tools, heard her cry above the roar of the wind. He reached the porch in 3 long strides, finding her gripping the arms of her chair, her face pale, her body trembling. Inside, he yelled over the din, his hand closing firmly on her arm. He guided her into the relative safety of the cabin, the doors slamming shut behind them with a boom. The small space felt even smaller with the fury of the storm raging outside. Rain lashed against the windowpane. Elara was shaking uncontrollably, the amplified sounds disorienting and terrifying. She stumbled, her cane clattering to the floor. Thomas caught her, his hands on her shoulders steadying her. For a moment, they stood thus, the storm a wild chorus around them, his touch a surprising anchor in the chaos. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough but closer to her ear than it had ever been. "Just wind and rain. The cabin's strong." He didn't let go immediately, and in that moment, something shifted. A crack in the wall of his reserve, a flicker of something other than gruff necessity in his touch. He guided her to sit on her cot, picked up her cane, and placed it in her hand. The storm raged on for hours, but within the cabin, a new, fragile quiet began to settle. He found himself talking more that evening, describing past storms, his voice a low rumble that seemed to counter the wind's fury. She listened, her fear slowly receding, replaced by a tentative sense of security she hadn't felt in a long, long time. He was learning that words, even his few, could be a shelter. In the storm's aftermath, the air was washed clean, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. Elara felt a subtle shift within herself, a quieting of the constant, thrumming anxiety. She began to venture further, learning the feel of the path to the creek with Thomas's grudging permission and Jed, the old dog, as her silent, furry guide. She discovered a patch of wild mint by its scent and gathered some, offering to make tea. Thomas, surprised, accepted. The taste was fresh, a welcome change from his usual bitter coffee. She asked if he had anything that needed mending. Her fingers, she explained, were still nimble. He hesitantly produced a shirt with a torn sleeve. She sat on the porch, the sun warm on her back, and stitched it with neat, even motions, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her, a strange ache in his chest. He hadn't realized how threadbare his own existence had become until her quiet presence began to stitch new textures into it. One of his milk cows took sick, a calf struggling beside her. For 2 days, Thomas fought to save them, barely sleeping, his face etched with worry and exhaustion. Elara, feeling helpless, did what she could. She made sure there was always warm broth for him, fresh water. She sat near the distressed cow, her voice a low, soothing murmur, her hand gently stroking the animal's heaving flank when Thomas had to step away. The cow, surprisingly, seemed to quiet under her touch. The calf, too, nuzzled her hand when she offered it a rag soaked in watered-down milk. Thomas found her there one dawn, asleep sitting up, her cheek resting against the cow's side, the calf nestled at her feet. The cow was breathing easier. He stood for a long moment, watching the unlikely tableau. This blind teacher, left for lost, possessed a strength, a quiet fortitude that humbled him. She wasn't a burden, she was something else. Something that made the silence of his ranch less empty. He was learning that compassion had its own language, one that needed no eyes to be understood. Weeks later, the distant sound of an approaching wagon and horses broke the morning quiet. Thomas, tensing, went to the door. A sturdy buckboard pulled up, carrying 2 men. One, a portly man in a dusty town suit, was the stage agent from a larger depot further down the line. The other, a younger man with an anxious face, introduced himself as Mr. Abernathy, the representative from the Sweetwater Creek School Board. "We've been searching for Miss Vance," the agent announced, his voice booming with false bonhomie. "Terrible mistake, terrible. Driver misread his route sheet. We're here to take her to Sweetwater Creek. All expenses paid, of course." Elara, who had come to stand just inside the doorway, felt a jolt. Sweetwater Creek. Her destination. The life she had planned. She could hear the relief in Mr. Abernathy's voice, the businesslike tone of the agent. Thomas said nothing. He stepped aside, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the visitors. He expected her to go. It was what she'd wanted, what she'd come all this way for. Mr. Abernathy stepped forward. "Miss Vance. We are so relieved to have found you. Your classroom is ready. The children are eager." Elara listened to his words, but her attention was on the silence emanating from Thomas. She thought of the rough cabin, the scent of pine and wood smoke, the feel of Jed's fur beneath her fingers, the steady, quiet presence of the man who had taken her in. She thought of the harshness of this land, but also of its stark beauty, described to her in his hesitant words. Sweetwater Creek was an unknown. This place, this man, they were becoming known. She turned her face towards where she knew Thomas stood. "Mr. Harding," she said, her voice clear and steady, "has been more than kind. He gave me shelter when I had none." "Yes, well, we're very grateful to him," the agent said impatiently. "Shall we get your things, Miss Vance?" Elara took a slow breath. The choice was clear, yet her heart felt heavy with a strange indecision. The school, the children, it was a purpose. But what she had found here, it was different. A quiet space where she was not poor blind Miss Vance, but simply Elara. A place where her other senses had come alive, where she had found a measure of peace, even a sense of belonging. She addressed the agent, but her words were for Thomas. "I thank you for finding me, gentlemen. But I believe my journey has taken an unexpected turn." She paused, then added softly, "I find I am not ready to leave this place just yet." Mr. Abernathy looked aghast. The agent frowned. "But Miss Vance, your position." "Perhaps," Elara said, a small, brave smile touching her lips, "there are other ways to teach. And other things to learn." She turned more fully towards Thomas, her unseen gaze searching for him. "Mr. Harding. If it wouldn't be too much trouble. I believe I could be of some use here." The silence stretched, taut and long. The two visitors exchanged uneasy glances. Then, Thomas moved. She heard the scuff of his boot. He cleared his throat, and when he spoke, his voice was rougher than usual, laden with an emotion she couldn't quite name, but it made her heart lift. "The teaching, out here, it's different, ma'am." He took a step closer, and then another, until he stood before her. His calloused, work-roughened hand reached out, gently finding hers. His touch was warm, firm, a grounding connection in the vast quiet of the prairie. "Reckon I've got a lot to learn myself." His fingers closed around hers, a silent promise in the dim light of the cabin. The agent and Mr. Abernathy eventually departed, bewildered and muttering, leaving behind them a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the quiet understanding of two souls who had found an unexpected haven in each other. Elara leaned slightly into his presence, the scent of sun and earth that was uniquely him a comfort. The ranch owner had offered her shelter, and in return, the blind teacher had shown him a way to see the world, and his own life, with new eyes. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, leave a like and subscribe for more.